Hi, boys and girls. Today we're going to be talking about a particular kind of folk tale called a myth. And there are so many myths around the world, but all myths come from a genre of stories called folklore. Genre just means a type of story. So science fiction is a genre, romance is a genre, horror stories are a genre. It's just the type of story. So myths are actually historical stories in that they are very, very old. So all myths have that in common, that they're all very old. Every culture in the world has myths. And the other thing about myths that we know from Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters is that because they're so old and a long time ago people didn't read or write, the stories had to be passed on from generation to generation through the spoken word. So people would sit around the campfire, or parents would teach their children with myths. So myths have a purpose, right? Some of them were used to explain how the world began, or they were to explain why humans behave the way they do, or they explain why nature behaves the way it does. So the thing about myths that we also know is that generally myths are written by people, but we don't know who wrote them and we don't know when they were written. We just know they were written long, long, long time ago. So here are some different myths. There are creation myths. Those are to explain how the world was created or how a group of people came to exist. Or there are nature myths to explain why things are the way they are in nature. For example, how did the elephant get its long trunk? Every continent in the world has some form of myth. And like I said, they're ancient, which means they're very old. And here are some examples of some myths from around the world. There are Greek and Roman myths from thousands of years ago, Norse myths, those are from Northern Europe, from Scandinavia, from Denmark and Norway and Sweden. There are Native American myths that come from North American continent and the South American continent. Of course, there are African myths. There are Maori myths, which are from Australia and New Zealand area. Chinese myths, Japanese myths, Indian myths, myths from everywhere around the world. And what was the purpose of myths again? To explain how or why something in nature came to be. So for example, here's a camel, and the myth would explain how the camel got its hump. And that's from the Just So stories that came from the Middle East and Asia. Here are some myths that started long time ago in Germany and in the Netherlands, where parents were trying to teach their kids a lesson. So in this lesson, this story, it's called Struwwelpeter, and the story is about a boy who refused to wash and refused to comb his hair. And so this was very frightening to children because his nails grew and his hair was a mess. And then what kind of lesson do you think this is supposed to teach? Here a boy kept rocking in his chair, and then finally he fell over and he pulled the hot soup on himself. So that was a lesson to teach the children not to rock in their chairs, otherwise they could cause some serious damage. Some characteristics again of myths is that they're gods and goddesses. Here's the god Poseidon from ancient myths, and then there might be some magical creatures, or for example, a character might transform from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. When we talk about the leopard and how it got its spots in the beginning, it didn't have spots, and then it transformed or changed from the beginning of the story to have spots at the end of the story. And the other important thing about myths, boys and girls, is that they represent the culture where they're from. So they were to teach kids from the culture where they were from why things were so in nature, or in their homes, the rules in their homes, for example, not rocking in your chairs, or how lightning came to be. So there's some really fabulous myths out there. I urge you to look at them, but today we're going to be reading Bear and Fire. And I wonder, where do you think this myth came from? And I also want you to think about how do the characters change from the beginning to the end? And I also want you to think about what is the lesson that you're supposed to learn from this. All right, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed this myth, Bear and Fire.